In this, the 39th lesson in the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine the challenges faced by the Obama administration and the Democrats after losing a majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. Liberalism as a centrist force was declared by many to be dead in American politics. The middle ground was gone as politicians scrambled for financial and activist support on ideological grounds. In an interview conducted in January of 2013 by the Conservative National Review, author Charles Kesler offered this assessment of President Obama's defense of liberalism. Obama thinks he has saved liberalism because he's put it on the winning side again, and in a big way. He takes pride in showing that the era of big government is not over, that in fact the future belongs to much higher taxes and to much more activist government. I think he's profoundly wrong about that. The Republican Party's midterm victories to retake the majority in the U.S. House of Representatives provided Charles Kesler with good reason to conclude as he did. The Republicans scored an important political victory by forcing the Obama administration to extend the Bush tax cuts. There would be no well-reasoned tax reform. There would be no well-reasoned effort to move forward toward a full employment society. Thanks to the Federal Reserve Board's actions, the circulating money supply had grown to over $2 trillion by the end of 2009, an increase of 146% in 3 years. Yet Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke confidently stated there was no threat of inflation, even as land and property prices were again rising in parts of the country. If one accepted the government's statistics and the judgment of mainstream economic measurement, the U.S. economy was responding to the stimulus package. By the traditional measure of gross domestic product, the recession was declared over at the end of the first quarter of 2009. Yet the economy was neither creating very many new jobs nor pulling up household incomes. Between June 2009, when the recession officially ended, and June 2011, inflation-adjusted median household income reportedly fell 6.7% to just over $50,000. The Fed's 2010 end-of-year report on the U.S. economy pointed to increased manufacturing output, higher consumer spending, and more jobs being created as positive signs. At the same time, the number of residential foreclosures continued to weigh heavily on property markets. In April of 2011, President Obama announced the administration's plan for cutting $4 trillion from the deficit over the next decade by a combination of spending cuts and increased taxes on individuals with the highest incomes. Conservatives voiced their opposition to any tax increases, ignoring the plight of those below the top. The administration's plan called for raising $1 trillion in taxes over 12 years, in part by allowing the Bush-era tax cuts for the wealthy to expire. As the president put the situation, in December of 2010, I agreed to extend the tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans because it was the only way I could prevent a tax hike on middle-class Americans. But we cannot afford $1 trillion worth of tax cuts for every millionaire and billionaire in our society. We can't afford it, and I refuse to renew them again. What the president could have conveyed to the American public was the need to relieve earned income from taxation and begin to raise more and more of the nation's revenue from public collection of rents from all its sources. He could have justified the return to a truly progressive individual income tax structure on the basis that a large portion of high incomes comes from rent-seeking investment activities and is not earned. In June of 2011, Chairman Bernanke delivered a speech on the U.S. economy at the International Monetary Conference in Atlanta. He reported that growth had slowed. The U.S. economic growth so far this year looks to have been somewhat slower than expected. Aggregate output increased at only 1.8% at an annual rate in the first quarter, and supply chain disruptions associated with the earthquake and tsunami in Japan are hampering economic activity this quarter. A number of indicators also suggest some loss of momentum in the labor market in recent weeks. We are, of course, monitoring these developments. That said, with the effects of the Japanese disaster on manufacturing output likely to dissipate in coming months, and with some moderation in gasoline prices in prospect, growth seems likely to pick up somewhat in the second half of the year. Overall, the economic recovery appears to be continuing at a moderate pace, albeit at a rate that is both uneven across sectors and frustratingly slow from the perspective of millions of unemployed and underemployed workers. The chairman also expressed a view that the only real concern over rising consumer prices was with gasoline, although other commodity prices were also rising. Despite historically low interest rates for mortgage loans, property sales continued at a low level. 1/5 of all owners of residential property continued to owe more on their mortgage loan than the property could be sold for, an indication that in many parts of the country, either property markets had collapsed or that the bottom in land prices was not yet over. Of course, there were exceptions. At the end of 2011, new foreclosures outpaced foreclosure sales by a factor of 3 to 1. As a result, the existing home inventory due to foreclosures was growing by 3 times the rate of foreclosure sales. However, across the nation, the percent of foreclosure sales was declining against the total number of properties sold. Mortgage banking firms had only 3 outlets for the loans they originated: Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or Ginnie Mae, now that the private label MBS market had collapsed. Commercial banks could, of course, originate for their own portfolios. Higher down payment requirements and tightened credit standards meant that the residential real estate markets would not right away become a major driver in the new business cycle. The construction of new homes was running at about 1/2 of the pre-2007 number. However, permits for the construction of apartment buildings had been increasing for several years. Part of the demand was coming from households whose properties went to foreclosure sale. Large numbers of younger adults did not have the savings and could not meet income and credit levels required for mortgage loan approval. In a study published during the fourth quarter of 2011, Princeton University economics professor Henry Farber reported that people who lost jobs in the recession and later found work again received an average of 17.5% less than they had received in their former jobs. His conclusion? As a labor economist, I do not think the recession has ended. Job losers are having more trouble than ever before finding full-time jobs. And as one would expect, the highest levels of unemployment continued among those with the least formal education. What would the Republicans do if they gained the presidency and retained the majority in the House of Representatives? Victor Fleischer, a tax law professor at the University of Colorado who has written extensively about private equity and taxes, identified their main interest. People like Mitt Romney make a lot of money, but they pay very little income tax. Then, by dodging the estate and gift tax, they are able to build dynastic wealth. When anyone calls for a return to a truly progressive tax system, self-described conservatives quickly label proponents as socialists. Asked his opinion in March of 2012 by Anthony Mason of CBS whether he agrees with accusations that the president was waging class warfare by pushing for Wall Street reforms and higher taxes for the rich, Paul Volcker said, "I don't understand the depth of that feeling. I really don't. This business that he's a great socialist and out to undermine the free enterprise system and so forth, I just think it has no connection with reality." In April of 2012, 5 financial giants, Bank of America, Citibank, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Ally Financial, GMAC, agreed to pay $26 billion to compensate homeowners for using, quote, foreclosure mills that pushed paperwork through the courts so fast that due process was tossed into the wind. The unemployment rate that started the year at 8.5% declined to 7.7%, but not because jobs were created, but largely because many people gave up looking for work and were no longer counted as unemployed. By the end of 2012, more than a dozen banks were under investigation for manipulating reports used in setting the London Interbank Offered Rate in order to make the loans look stronger than they actually were. Barclays agreed to pay $450 million in penalties. Swiss bank UBS agreed to pay a $1.5 billion settlement. One bright spot was fast changing the course of the economy. New technologies were strengthening domestic energy production. Oil production climbed by 760,000 barrels per day during 2012 to over 6 million barrels. Much of this came from shale formation extraction in North Dakota, Montana, and other states. During December of 2012, the Fed pledged to keep interest rates low until the unemployment rate fell to 6.5%. Besides the constant purchasing of U.S. government securities and mortgage-backed securities, there was little more the Fed could do. None of the structural flaws in the economic system had been removed to minimize rent-seeking speculative activity. The jobless rate remained high at 8.1%. Home ownership dropped for a 5th straight year to 64.6%, the lowest in more than a decade, hurt by more stringent financing rules and a shift to renting. Even more insightful of the real economy, nearly 46 million people were now using food stamps. The gap between rich and poor was continuing to grow. The bottom 80% of the population reportedly owned just 7% of all forms of assets. If anything, the wealth gap between people of different races was widening. The racial wealth gap is related quite directly to the far lower rates of home ownership among blacks and Hispanics, the source of nearly 40% of the net worth of whites. According to Forbes, the 400 wealthiest Americans had more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans combined. By the end of 2012, the U.S. government debt soared past $16 trillion and continued to climb. The full picture is perhaps best explained by the fact that during Barack Obama's first term as president, the federal government accumulated more debt than it did under the first 42 U.S. presidents combined. Other signs of a weakening U.S. economy included the skyrocketing trade deficit with China, which came to $315 billion in 2012. That was the largest trade deficit that one nation has had with another nation in the history of the world. An important question was what the Chinese trading partners would do with all of the dollars they were receiving in return for their goods. The policy objective of the People's Bank of China was to maintain a weakened Chinese currency by agreeing to purchase nearly all U.S. dollars accumulated by Chinese exporters and corporations. The bank purchased the dollars with borrowed funds. Selling such large amounts of Chinese currency is inflationary, so the bank sterilized the resulting liquidity by issuing debt or raising the required reserve ratio of capital that must be set aside by Chinese banks. Chinese financial managers were already using surplus U.S. dollars to invest in private equity, real estate, corporate shares and bonds, and other U.S. assets. As ever more dollars came in, their investment activity exploded. Data on the amount of these investments is not published, and of course, the Chinese are far from the only foreign investors in U.S. real estate. Mason Gaffney, following the policy decisions of government officials and the advice provided by their economic advisors, saw little about which to be optimistic. He wrote, "What are the prospects for another endogenous 18-year cycle, peaking and crashing in about 2026? Now, in 2012, politicians and bankers and land speculators are already seeking to start again on the same trajectory, the only route to prosperity they know. Already, the Reichsbank has awarded the latest Nobel in economics to Thomas Sargent, the rational expectations man. Public policy at every level is bent to sustain and revive land prices, equated with recovery and prosperity. Banks too big to fail are bailed out, and no bankers jailed." Despite determined opposition from the right, on November 6, 2012, voters returned Barack Obama for a second term as president. Mason Gaffney, among others, had little hope that he and his economic team had learned what was wrong and what to do about it. In his State of the Union speech, President Obama stated the obvious regarding the manner in which income and wealth continue to become ever more concentrated. But we gather here knowing that there are millions of Americans whose hard work and dedication have not yet been rewarded. Our economy is adding jobs, but too many people still can't find full-time employment. Corporate profits have skyrocketed to all-time highs, but for more than a decade, wages and incomes have barely budged. Even Joseph Stiglitz, the one economist recognized internationally as a critic of the laws and policies causing widespread inequality and poverty, has not yet quite come to an understanding that a significant element of corporatism was the private appropriation of rent in all its forms. In a July 2013 column published in the New York Times, he offered his perspective. Economic power often speaks louder than moral values, and in the many instances in which American corporate interests prevail in intellectual property rights, our policies help increase inequality abroad. In most countries, it's much the same as in the United States. The lives of the poor are sacrificed at the altar of corporate profits. But even in those where, say, the government would provide a test like Myriad's at affordable prices for all, there is a cost. When a government pays monopoly prices for a medical test, it takes money away that could be spent for other life-saving health expenditures. And when a government fails to use the tax mechanism to collect the rents of land, government must resort to the taxation of earned incomes, of the physical assets produced, and the commerce in which we engage. When this fails to raise sufficient revenue, the next option is to go into the credit markets and borrow from those who have the savings to loan to the government at interest, And when this is too costly, pressure comes to the Federal Reserve to create new purchasing power out of thin air in order to acquire government bonds.